So this video will review what Pollock and Cruz have to say about the definition of knowledge. So here's the old philosophical definition. And when I say this is the old philosophical definition, what I mean is this. Pollock and Cruz say that this definition dominated epistemology from the early 20th century until 1963. More generally, this definition has been at least a main definition, if not the main definition, for thousands of years. So here we go. The definition is knowledge is justified true belief. And the is here is meant to be the is of identity. It's meant to say not just that knowledge has these features, but that these features are necessary and sufficient for being knowledge. So here's something which says knowledge is sufficient for these features. If somebody knows some proposition, then that person believes that proposition, that person is justified in believing that proposition, and that proposition is true. So these three conditions are all necessary conditions for knowledge, which is to say knowledge is sufficient conditions for them. Next, if someone meets these three conditions, then that person knows the proposition. So if X knows P, then X must be justified in believing P, and P must be true. And if X has a justified true belief in a proposition, then X knows that proposition. So this is saying that these three conditions are sufficient for knowledge and that knowledge is necessary for these three conditions. So knowledge is both necessary and sufficient for these three conditions. Now that's the traditional definition. Edmund Gettier, a philosopher in 1963, pointed out some problems with this condition. Pollock and Cruz talk about those problems, or one of those problems in the text. I'm going to actually use an earlier version of the problem that comes from Bertrand Russell, and here's the version. You have Maroon here, and she looks at the clock and sees that it's 1:10 p.m. And on the basis of seeing that the clock says 1:10 p.m., she forms the belief that it's 1:10 p.m. I guess I'm calling her Red. So Red believes that it's 1:10 p.m., and Red is justified in believing that it's 1:10 p.m. Why? Because she bases her belief on seeing the clock, and in general, clocks are a good guide to the time. We could even add that Red has particular reason to believe that this clock is reliable, like she checks it every morning. And let's suppose further that it's true that it's 1:10 p.m. So Red believes it's 1:10 p.m., she's justified in believing it, and it's true. So Red has a true justified belief that it's 1:10 p.m. Now let's suppose finally that the clock is broken. Although she checked it this morning, by 1:10 p.m. It had stopped. It's no longer working. It just so happens that Red looks at the clock at the moment when it stops. Or if we suppose she checked it the day before, at the moment when it stopped the day before. So she checks it at the exact time when the clock broke the day before. Does Red know that it's 1:10 p.m.? Well, most philosophers say no. They say in this case, there's something defective about Red's justification for her belief that it's 1:10 p.m. And given that kind of defect, we don't really want to say Red knows the time. They think instead that one can't get knowledge of the time from a broken clock. And more generally, one can't get knowledge of a state of the world unless one's justification is somehow connected to that state of the world. And that's the problem here, is that Red's belief that it's 1:10 p.m. is based on what the clock says. But what the clock says isn't connected to the time anymore because the clock is stopped. So the truth, the fact that it's 1:10 p.m., is completely disconnected from the evidence, the clock, that Red uses to form her belief. If those philosophers who think this isn't knowledge are right, then knowledge can't be exhaustively defined as justified true belief. Those can still be necessary conditions for knowledge, but they're not jointly sufficient. Something more than justified true belief is required in order to get to knowledge. Why? Because Red has a justified true belief that it's 1:10 p.m., but it isn't knowledge. So this raises an obvious question: what is knowledge? And most philosophers agree that what's missing in the clock case is some sort of connection between the truth maker, the fact that it's 1:10 p.m., that is what makes that true, and the justification, Red's evidence or reason for believing that it's 1:10 p.m. Pollock and Cruz suggest that we shouldn't focus our attention on this problem. It's an interesting puzzle, they think, that can be fun to explore, but it shouldn't be the centerpiece of epistemology. It shouldn't be what epistemologists first and foremost try and understand. rather than trying to understand the meaning of the word knowledge or the property, what the property knowledge is, they suggest we should focus on epistemic norms, on justification, on the rules and guidelines that govern rational belief formation. I happen to think they're right. You're free to disagree. But I think the most pressing task for epistemologists is to figure out how we should form beliefs and not to try to define knowledge. Okay. So we'll stop this video there.